The morning light of Kepler 442b filtered through the dome-shaped windows of the Galactic Academy's xenobiology classroom. 23 students from various species across the galaxy sat in their specially designed seats, each accommodation reflecting the unique physiology of its occupant. The Xanthari with their crystalline exoskeletons gleamed like living gemstones, while the fluid-form Aquarians rippled gently in their containment suits. Near the back, almost hidden behind a taller Drachmaran student, sat what appeared to be a rather unremarkable bipedal figure. Professor Vexhai clicked his mandibles nervously as he prepared for today's lesson. The elderly insectoid had taught xenobiology for over 40 standard years, but today's subject always made his chitin crawl. He activated the holographic display, and immediately the classroom filled with gasps and nervous chittering. "Class 12, he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Today we discuss the most dangerous classification in our galactic database. Deathworld organisms." The hologram showed a planet, blue and green, swirled with white clouds. Beautiful, yet somehow ominous in its very normalcy. A few students leaned back in their seats instinctively. "This," Professor Vexhai continued, "is Sol 3, also known as Terra or Earth. Gravity 1 standard, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, and a stellar radiation level that would cook most civilized species within minutes of exposure. But that's not what makes it truly terrifying." A Xanthari student, her crystal body refracting the light into rainbow patterns, raised a delicate appendage. "Professor, surely no sentient life could evolve on such a hostile world." The professor's compound eyes seemed to dim. "That, Miss Shaltha, is where you are wrong. Not only did sentient life evolve there, but it thrived, and when they finally achieved spaceflight." He paused, manipulating the holographic controls. "Well, let me show you what we're dealing with." The display shifted to show various creatures from Earth. A great white shark tearing through water with prehistoric hunger. A silverback gorilla beating its chest, muscles rippling with barely contained power. A honey badger, small but fearless, taking on creatures 10 times its size. "These are just the non-sentient species," the professor explained. "Notice the common characteristics: enhanced muscle density, redundant organ systems, extreme territorial behavior, and most concerning of all, they seem to actually seek out danger rather than avoid it." A young Etherian, her gaseous form shimmering with anxiety, whispered, "But Professor, what about the sentient species from this world?" Professor Vexhai's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme nervousness among his kind. "They call themselves humans, and they are by far the most dangerous predator their world has ever produced." The classroom fell silent except for the gentle humming of life support systems. In the back row, the unremarkable bipedal student shifted slightly, pulling his hood down further over his features. "Humans," the professor continued, "possess several characteristics that make them uniquely terrifying. First, their physical capabilities." He brought up a new hologram showing human anatomy. "They are pursuit predators. On their homeworld, they would chase prey for days without stopping, literally running their victims to death through exhaustion." A Drachmaran student, his reptilian features pale, spoke up. "Surely that's an exaggeration, Professor? I wish it were. Humans have a cooling system unlike any other sentient species. They leak water through their skin to regulate temperature. This allows them to maintain pursuit even in conditions that would cause most creatures to die from overheating. Their ancestors hunted mammoth creatures weighing several tons using nothing but persistence and sharp sticks." The professor moved to the next display. "But physical prowess is not their most dangerous attribute. It's their psychology." The hologram now showed human settlements. Cities rising from nothing. Bridges spanning impossible distances. Structures reaching toward the sky in defiance of gravity itself. Humans have a concept they call stubbornness. When faced with an impossible situation, rather than retreating or finding an alternative solution like any sensible species, humans simply refuse to accept that something is impossible. They will throw themselves at a problem repeatedly, each failure only making them more determined. A nervous laugh rippled through the classroom, though it sounded more like frightened chirping from several species. They've been observed attempting to tame their planet's apex predators for companionship, the professor continued. They've domesticated wolves, creatures that hunt in coordinated packs, and turned them into pets. They swim with creatures that could easily devour them whole, claiming it's fun. The hooded figure in the back had gone very still. Most disturbing of all. Professor Vexhi's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Is their concept of heroism. When faced with danger, quote, their first instinct isn't self-preservation. It's to protect others, even at the cost of their own lives. They will literally throw themselves into certain death to save complete strangers. A Zenthari student's crystalline structure was beginning to dim with stress. Professor, you're saying they're altruistic predators? The worst kind, he confirmed. Because it means you can never truly predict their behavior. A normal predator acts for survival, territory, or food. Humans act on principle. They have concepts like justice and fairness that override their survival instincts entirely. The professor manipulated the controls again, and the display showed various human achievements. They've survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and mass extinctions. When their technology wasn't sufficient to overcome an obstacle, they simply made better technology. When their environment was too harsh, they adapted it to suit them rather than adapting to it. But surely, a small Pixian piped up, her crystalline voice tinkling like bells. They must have some weaknesses? Something that keeps them in check? Professor Vexhi's expression became even more grave. That's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Their weakness is also their strength. They form what they call emotional bonds with other beings. They will sacrifice everything. Their lives, their resources, their very future, to protect those they care about. But this same capacity for emotional attachment means they're capable of incredible fury when those bonds are threatened. He brought up historical data, showing various conflicts from human history. They've waged wars lasting decades over abstract concepts. They've rebuilt entire civilizations from ashes rather than surrender. When angry enough, they become tactically unpredictable. They'll accept massive losses to achieve their objectives. The classroom had grown noticeably colder as environmental systems responded to the collective stress pheromones being released by the students. Now, the professor said, returning to his normal teaching tone, the good news is that humans are contained to their home system. The Galactic Council has established a strict quarantine around Sol 3. As long as we maintain that barrier, we should never have to face these creatures directly. A relieved sigh seemed to flow through the room. However, and here his voice took on a warning tone, intelligence suggests they're developing faster than light technology. Some xenobiologists theorize that their Deathworld evolution has given them an almost supernatural ability to solve technical problems. If they achieve interstellar travel. He left the sentence hanging, letting the implications sink in. Your assignment for next week, he announced, is to read Chapter 47 on theoretical encounter protocols with Deathworld species, and prepare a discussion on how galactic civilization might respond to human contact. As students began gathering their materials, chattering nervously among themselves, the hooded figure in the back row stood up quietly. He was tall for his apparent species, moving with an unusual grace that didn't quite match any known alien physiology. As he walked past other students toward the exit, a few glanced at him curiously. Strange, muttered a Drachmaran to his seat partner. I don't recognize his species. What do you think he is? His companion, a young Etherian, shimmered thoughtfully. I'm not sure. He's been in our classes for months, but he never speaks up during discussions, always sits in the back, keeps to himself. Maybe he's from one of the Outer Rim colonies, the Drachmaran suggested. You know how isolated some of those settlements can be. Donna. Meanwhile, the hooded figure had reached the corridor outside the classroom. He paused for a moment, seeming to listen to the continued discussions inside about humanity's terrifying capabilities. A slight smile crossed his features, though in the dim hallway lighting, it was impossible to see clearly. As he walked away, His gait held a particular rhythm, a natural cadence that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone from his homeworld. But here, among aliens who had never seen a human walk, it was just another curiosity about the quiet student who never quite seemed to fit in. Behind him, Professor Vexhai was shutting down the holographic displays, muttering to himself about Deathworld species and the nightmares they gave him. He had no idea that his most terrifying subject had just walked out of his classroom, carrying with it the knowledge of exactly how the galaxy viewed his kind. The hooded figure continued down the corridor, passing other students and faculty members. None of them noticed the way his eyes tracked movement with predatory precision, or how his breathing remained perfectly controlled despite the stress of the situation. None of them recognized the subtle signs of a persistent predator moving among them. As he rounded the corner toward the dormitory section, he pulled out a small communication device, not standard Galactic Academy equipment, but something sleeker, more advanced. The message he composed was brief. Day 127. Integration proceeding normally. Cultural assessment of human-alien relations requires significant revision. Beginning. Phase 2 observations. He paused before sending, looking back toward the classroom where his fellow students were still discussing the theoretical horrors of encountering his species. Then, with another slight smile, he added, Note: Professor Vexhai's fear responses suggest successful psychological warfare potential if diplomatic contact fails. The message disappeared into quantum space, traveling faster than light toward a small blue planet at the edge of an unremarkable solar system, where other members of his species were very interested in learning about their galactic neighbors. After all, humans had always been exceptionally good at intelligence gathering. It was just another one of those terrifying Deathworlder traits that the professor had somehow forgotten to mention in his lecture. The figure disappeared into his dormitory, leaving behind only questions and the faintest scent of something that didn't quite belong among the sterile corridors of the Galactic Academy. Something that smelled like rain and earth, and the wild spaces of a world where everything was designed to kill you. Something that smelled like home. 3 days after Professor Vexhai's lecture on Deathworld species, the Galactic Academy buzzed with nervous energy. Students gathered in small groups, discussing the terrifying creatures from Sol 3 Inch's hushed whispers. The fear was palpable, spreading through the academic halls like a virus. The hooded figure who called himself Marcus Chen, according to his student identification, moved through these conversations like a ghost. His enhanced hearing picked up fragments of discussion from every species. Did you hear about the emergency council meeting? A Zenthari student was saying to her study group. They're considering upgrading the Sol system quarantine protocols. I read that human ships might be capable of exceeding light speed within the next solar cycle. Another replied, her crystalline form flickering with anxiety. What if they're already out there? Marcus adjusted his hood and continued walking. The irony wasn't lost on him that his very presence here proved their fears were already realized. In the Academy's central courtyard, he found an unusual crowd gathered around the news projection system. The holographic display showed a Galactic Council emergency broadcast, featuring Chairman Veltar of the Etherian Collective. Citizens of the galaxy, the shimmering gas being intoned. New intelligence suggests that the Deathworld species known as humans have achieved primitive faster-than-light capability. All Outer Rim colonies are advised to increase security measures and report any unusual ship signatures immediately. A collective shiver ran through the assembled students. Marcus noted their fear responses with clinical interest. Rapid breathing among the oxygen breathers. Color changes in the photosynthetic species. Defensive clustering behaviors across the board. Furthermore, Chairman Veltar continued, the Science Council has released additional data about human capabilities that were previously classified. The display shifted to show more Earth creatures, this time focusing on pack hunters. Humans exhibit extraordinary coordination capabilities. They can communicate complex tactical information through subtle vocal tones and facial expressions. Their ability to work as a unified group while maintaining individual tactical flexibility has been deemed unprecedented in galactic records. A young Drachmaron near Marcus muttered, as if they weren't terrifying enough individually. Marcus suppressed a smile. If only they knew about human technology, human medicine, or human engineering. The Academy's computer systems, which they considered highly advanced, were actually several generations behind what his people had achieved. The quantum communicator in his pocket was proof enough of that. The broadcast continued. Reports from deep space monitoring stations suggest unusual energy signatures near the Sol system barrier. Citizens are reminded that any contact with Deathworld species should be immediately reported to local authorities. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus noticed a group of students heading toward the advanced xenobiology laboratory. He followed at a distance, curious about their intentions. The lab was one of the Academy's most sophisticated facilities, containing specimens and data from thousands of worlds. Today, it seemed several students had arranged a private study session to examine Deathworld biology more closely. "I still can't believe creatures like this actually exist," said Zephyra, a Pixian whose crystalline form was dim with stress. She was examining holographic recreations of Earth predators. "Look at these tigers. Solitary hunters with enough raw power to take down creatures 3 times their size." Her study partner, a fluid aquarian named Riptide, rippled with nervous energy inside his containment suit. And humans supposedly domesticated similar creatures for companionship. It's madness. Marcus lingered near the lab's entrance, pretending to study data on his personal tablet while actually observing their reactions. It was fascinating to see how different species processed fear, and how universally terrifying they found his people. "I've been researching their military history," added a Drachmaron student named Torgak. "Did you know they've never had a period in their recorded history without some form of armed conflict? They literally don't know how to exist without warfare." "That's not the worst part," Zephyra said, her voice barely audible. "I found records suggesting they have something called sports, where they simulate combat for entertainment. They voluntarily subject themselves to physical trauma because they think it's fun." Marcus couldn't help himself. He stepped closer to their study area and spoke for the first time in their presence. "Actually, sports serve multiple evolutionary purposes: physical conditioning, tactical training, social bonding, and stress management, all combined into recreational activity." The 3 students turned toward him with expressions of surprise. They had never heard him speak before. "You've studied human behavior?" Torgak asked, his reptilian features showing curiosity mixed with wariness. Marcus realized he had made an error. His response had been too knowledgeable, too detailed. A normal student wouldn't have insights into human psychology that weren't covered in basic xenobiology texts. "I find Deathworld species fascinating from a theoretical perspective," he said carefully. "The psychological adaptations required for survival on such worlds must be extraordinary." Riptide's aquatic form swirled thoughtfully. "What's your species again? I don't think I've seen your like before." Marcus felt a moment of genuine danger. His cover story had worked for months because most students didn't pay attention to the quiet figure in the back of classrooms. But now they were actively curious. "I'm from the Outer Rim," he said vaguely. "Mixed colony world. Not many of us make it to the core academy." It wasn't technically a lie. Earth was certainly on the outer rim of the galaxy from their perspective. "Interesting phenotype," Zephyra observed, her crystalline structure brightening as her scientific curiosity overcame her fear. "Bipedal, bilateral symmetry, what appears to be an internal skeletal structure." Marcus felt his pulse quicken, though he carefully controlled his breathing to avoid detection. Human cardiovascular responses to stress were definitely not something he wanted to demonstrate. "The hood is cultural," he said quickly. "Religious observance." "Of course," Torgak said respectfully. "I apologize for staring." The moment passed, but Marcus realized his situation was becoming more precarious. The heightened awareness of human capabilities was making his fellow students more observant, more likely to notice details that might give him away. As if summoned by his thoughts, the laboratory door opened, and Professor Vexhai entered with another instructor. Professor Clarion, the Academy's expert on galactic security protocols. "Students." Professor Vexhai greeted them. "I'm glad to see continued interest in yesterday's lesson. Professor Clarion has agreed to share some additional classified information about Deathworld containment protocols." The security professor was a tall, imposing Drachmaron with scales that had turned silver with age. His presence commanded immediate attention. The situation has become more serious than we initially disclosed, he began without preamble. Intelligence suggests that humans may have developed technology that makes them nearly impossible to detect using conventional sensors. End quote. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. How much did they actually know? Their ships appear to use some form of stealth technology that disguises their energy signatures, Professor Clarion continued. Worse, they seem capable of mimicking other species' technological patterns. A human vessel could theoretically appear to be anything from an Etherian transport to a Zenthari mining ship. But how is that possible? Zephyra asked, her crystalline form flickering with disbelief. Such technology would require computational capabilities far beyond what a Deathworld species could develop. Professor Clarion's expression grew even more grim. That assumption may have been our first mistake. We've been operating under the belief that hostile environments inhibit technological development. But evidence suggests the opposite may be true for humans. He activated a holographic display showing various human innovations throughout their history. Observe their progression. Every environmental challenge led to technological breakthroughs. Ice Age, they developed agriculture and permanent settlements. Resource scarcity, they created industry and trade networks. Natural disasters, they built structures that could withstand earthquakes and storms. Marcus watched his fellow students absorb this information with growing horror. They were beginning to understand what made humans truly dangerous. Not just their physical capabilities, but their refusal to accept limitations. But the most concerning development, Professor Clarion said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is intelligence suggesting that humans may have already breached the quarantine zone. The laboratory fell silent, except for the humming of life support systems. We've detected anomalous readings from several core world systems, he continued. Energy signatures that don't match any known technology, communication patterns that appear to be using quantum encryption methods we don't recognize, and most disturbing of all, reports of unidentified individuals at various galactic institutions. Marcus forced himself to remain perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The theoretical scenario, Professor Vexhai added, is that humans might be conducting reconnaissance operations, learning about us before making formal contact. Or before launching attacks, Professor Clarion said grimly. Torgok raised a trembling hand. Professor, what would we do if we actually encountered a human? How would we even recognize one? Professor Clarion manipulated the holographic controls, bringing up detailed scans of human physiology. Human infiltrators would likely attempt to blend in with existing populations. They might use technological disguises or simply rely on the fact that most galactic citizens have never seen their species. The image showed a human silhouette, with various biological markers highlighted. Key identifying characteristics: unusual muscle density, bilateral symmetry, specific organ arrangements, and most notably, their stress responses. Humans react to danger by increasing heart rate and respiratory function, while simultaneously focusing their attention with incredible precision. Marcus realized with growing alarm that these were exactly the responses he was experiencing right now. His human physiology was betraying him even as he tried to remain calm. However, Professor Clarion continued, humans are also extremely intelligent and adaptable. A trained infiltrator might have learned to suppress these responses, or might be using technology to mask them. How would we report a suspected human? Riptide asked, his aquatic form swirling with nervous energy. Any suspicious behavior, unusual knowledge of human capabilities, or individuals who seem unusually interested in galactic military capabilities should be reported immediately to campus security. Professor Clarion replied, the Council has established a special task force to investigate potential infiltration. Marcus felt sweat beginning to form on his skin. Another uniquely human stress response that could give him away if anyone noticed. He slowly reached up as if to adjust his hood, using the movement to discreetly wipe his forehead. Remember, Professor Vexhai added, humans are persistence predators. If one is among us, it will be patient, careful, and extremely observant. It might spend months or even years gathering information before revealing its true nature. The description hit uncomfortably close to home. Marcus had indeed been patient, careful, and observant for exactly the reasons they described. As the professors concluded their briefing and the students began to disperse, Marcus realized his mission had entered a new phase. The galaxy was actively looking for his kind now. His cover, while still intact, was becoming increasingly fragile. But as he made his way back to his dormitory, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride in his species. The professors had described human capabilities with fear and awe, never realizing they were essentially giving an operational briefing to the very threat they were trying to prepare for. The galaxy was afraid of humanity, and after spending months observing their capabilities, Marcus was beginning to understand why that fear might be entirely justified. Not because humans were monsters, but because they represented something far more dangerous: change itself. As he sealed himself in his quarters and began composing another encrypted report, Marcus reflected on the day's revelations. The galaxy was preparing for humanity's arrival with defensive measures and military protocols. But they were still thinking like prey animals trying to hide from predators. They had no idea that the real threat wasn't an invasion force coming to conquer them. The real threat was a species that would simply refuse to accept the galaxy's existing order, and would cheerfully tear down millennia of careful civilization just to rebuild it in a way that made more sense to Deathworld minds. Tomorrow's classes would be even more interesting. The emergency alarm cut through the morning air of the Galactic Academy like a blade through silk. Marcus Chen jerked awake in his dormitory bed, instantly alert in the way that only predator species could manage. The sound was wrong. Not the standard drill pattern he had memorized, but something urgent and chaotic. Through his room's communication system, Director Talvin's voice crackled with barely controlled panic. All students and faculty report to emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill. We have received word of an imminent threat to Academy security. Marcus dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Had his cover been blown? Were human ships actually approaching the system? Or was this something else entirely? As he made his way toward the designated shelter areas, he joined streams of frightened students and faculty. The corridors buzzed with nervous energy and panicked conversations in dozens of languages. "I heard it was pirates from the Void Rim," a Zenthari student was saying, her crystalline form pulsing with stress patterns. "No. Someone said it was a Deathworld species incursion," replied her companion, a young Etherean whose gaseous form was barely maintaining coherence. Marcus noticed Professor Vexai hurrying past, mandibles clicking frantically as he spoke into a communication device. Yes, I understand the severity, but are we certain it's actually humans? The sensor readings could be a false positive." The pieces began clicking together in Marcus's mind. This wasn't about him specifically. They had detected something that made them think humans had arrived at the Academy system. The main assembly hall had been converted into an emergency command center. Holographic displays showed the space around the Academy station, highlighting several contacts moving in from the system's edge. The readings were confusing. The signatures didn't match any known ship types, but they definitely weren't natural phenomena. Director Talven stood at the center of the chaos, her elongated draconic features tight with stress. "Ladies, gentlemen, and respected beings of all forms," she announced to the assembled crowd, "we have detected multiple unidentified vessels approaching Academy space. Their technology appears to be using stealth capabilities consistent with reports of human infiltration ships." A collective gasp rose from the assembled students and faculty. Marcus felt his pulse quicken despite his training. "All defensive systems have been activated," the director continued. "The Galactic Defense Force has been notified and ships are en route. However, given the speed of the approaching vessels, we may be looking at contact within the next few hours." Professor Clarion stepped forward from where he had been coordinating with security personnel. "Based on the movement patterns and technological signatures, we believe this may be a reconnaissance mission, rather than an outright attack. However, we must assume hostile intent." Marcus found himself in an impossible position. If these were actually human ships, they were probably here because of his intelligence reports. His people had come looking for him, or at least investigating the intelligence he had gathered. But if he revealed himself to help coordinate a peaceful contact, he would be exposing himself to a panicked alien population that viewed his very existence as a threat. The decision was taken from him when the lights suddenly dimmed and the station shuddered slightly. "What was that?" someone called out. Professor Clarion was checking his portable scanner, his scaled features pale. Something just latched onto the station's hull. External sensors show multiple attachment points. Director Talvin's voice took on a note of command. "Security teams to all hull breach points. All civilians remain in designated safe areas. If you encounter any unidentified individuals, do not attempt to engage. Retreat and alert security immediately." The assembled students huddled together in species-specific groups, their fear palpable. Marcus realized that this situation was rapidly spinning out of control. If humans had actually boarded the station, and the security teams encountered them, it could easily turn into a bloodbath based purely on the terror that had been building for weeks. His decision was made when a new alarm began sounding. The distinctive pattern that indicated hull breach. "Security teams report multiple breaches," Director Talvin announced, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Unknown individuals have entered the station. All civilians are to remain in safe areas while security personnel handle the situation." Marcus knew he had to act. His fellow students were terrified. Security personnel were likely to shoot first and ask questions later. And any human team boarding the station would be expecting resistance. The situation was perfectly set up for tragedy. He quietly made his way toward the edge of the crowd, trying to reach one of the corridor exits without drawing attention. But his movement was noticed by Zephyra, the Pixian student he had spoken with in the laboratory. "Where are you going?" she whispered, her crystalline form flickering with anxiety. "We're supposed to stay together." "I need to check something," Marcus said vaguely. But before he could continue, a new commotion erupted from one of the main corridor entrances. Security personnel came running backward into the assembly hall, their weapons drawn but not firing. Behind them, moving with fluid precision that seemed almost casual, came three figures in dark, form-fitting suits. The figures were clearly humanoid, but their equipment was unlike anything in the galactic database. Their movements held the same predatory grace that Marcus had been carefully suppressing for months. As they entered the assembly hall, their helmeted heads turned slowly, scanning the crowd with obvious tactical assessment. The lead figure raised one hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture, but the effect on the assembled aliens was immediate panic. Screams erupted from multiple species as students and faculty tried to crowd toward the exits. "Nobody move," Director Talvin shouted over the chaos. "Security, establish a perimeter." But the security personnel were clearly terrified. Their weapons trembled in their appendages as they tried to maintain firing positions on beings they had been taught to consider the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The lead human figure spoke, its voice carrying clearly through some kind of external speaker system. "We mean no harm. We are here to retrieve our colleague." The words sent a shock through the assembly. Several beings turned to look around desperately, as if trying to identify who among them could possibly be connected to these terrifying creatures. Marcus realized the situation had reached a critical point. His people had come for him, but they didn't know the exact situation. The aliens were on the verge of panic. The security forces were about to open fire on beings who could probably disable them without breaking stride, and somewhere in the confusion, people were going to get hurt. He stepped forward, pulling back his hood for the first time in months. The reaction was immediate. Every eye in the assembly hall locked onto him as his human features became visible. The bilateral symmetry, the forward-facing eyes of a predator, the facial structure that evolution had designed for pursuing prey across endless distances. "I believe," Marcus said calmly. "You're looking for me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background hum of life support systems seemed muted. Professor Vex High was the first to find his voice, his mandibles clicking rapidly. You're human." "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm a xenobiologist with the Human Exploration Initiative. I've been studying here for 7 months." Director Talvin's elongated features showed a complex mix of terror and confusion. Studying? You mean spying? Marcus shook his head. Learning. There's a difference. He gestured toward his classmates, many of whom were staring at him with expressions of shock and betrayal. For months, I've sat in classes where you discussed my species as if we were mythical monsters. I wanted to understand how the galaxy viewed humanity before we made formal contact. One of the human operatives stepped forward, removing their helmet to reveal a woman with short-cropped dark hair and the kind of scars that spoke of dangerous experience. Dr. Chen, we received your reports about accelerated galactic defensive preparations. Command decided it was time to establish direct communication. You could have just sent a message, Professor Clarion said, his voice tight with stress. The human operative. Marcus recognized her as Commander Sarah Harrison from her voice. Smiled grimly. Would you have believed it was really from us? Or would you have assumed it was some kind of elaborate deception? The question hung in the air because everyone present knew the answer. Marcus turned to address the assembly, noting how they instinctively stepped back from him even though nothing about his behavior had changed except their knowledge of what he was. Professor Vexhai, he said directly. Your lecture 3 days ago was remarkably accurate in most respects. Humans are persistence predators. We do refuse to accept impossible situations. We are dangerously stubborn. We form emotional bonds that override our survival instincts. And yes, we consider altruistic self-sacrifice to be heroic, rather than insane. The professor's compound eyes seemed to dim with fear. But, Marcus continued, you missed the most important point. We're also problem solvers. When we encounter a situation we don't understand, our first instinct isn't to destroy it. It's to figure out how it works. I have works. He gestured around the assembly hall. I could have spent these 7 months gathering intelligence on your defensive capabilities, mapping your infrastructure, identifying weaknesses for future exploitation. Instead, I attended classes on galactic history, learned about different species' cultural traditions, and discovered that the galaxy has spent thousands of years building something remarkable. Zephyra stepped forward slightly, her crystalline form flickering with confusion rather than fear. Then why? Why the secrecy? Why not just make open contact? Commander Harrison answered. Because you were terrified of us before you even knew we existed. Dr. Chen's reports showed that humanity was being discussed as a theoretical threat to galactic civilization. How do you think you would have reacted to an official first contact delegation? The answer was written in the expressions of everyone present. So what happens now? Director Talvin asked, her voice carefully controlled. Marcus exchanged glances with Commander Harrison before responding. Now, we start over. The right way. He pulled out his quantum communicator and activated a broader transmission frequency. This is Dr. Marcus Chen, reporting to both Human Command and Galactic Academy leadership. I'm requesting permission to begin official first contact protocols. The device crackled briefly before 2 voices responded simultaneously. One, clearly human. The other, the shocked tone of a Galactic Council representative who had apparently been monitoring the situation. Dr. Chen, this is Admiral Rodriguez. Permission granted. Try not to start an interstellar incident. Dr. Chen, this is Chairman Veltar of the Council. We need to discuss this situation at the highest levels. Marcus smiled, an expression that probably looked terrifying to most of the aliens present, but which he hoped they would eventually learn to recognize as genuinely friendly. There's something else you all need to understand, he said, addressing the assembly. Humanity isn't looking to conquer the galaxy or destroy your civilization. We're looking for a place to belong in it. Professor Vexhai's mandibles clicked uncertainly. But the Deathworld evolution, the predatory nature, makes us very good at protecting things we care about. Marcus finished. And after 7 months of studying your histories, your cultures, your achievements, we'd very much like to care about all of you. Commander Harrison stepped forward. The Human Federation is prepared to share our technological advances in exchange for membership in galactic civilization. We believe we can contribute to your security, your scientific advancement, and your general well-being. But why? Torgok asked. The Drakmaron's voice filled with genuine confusion. Why would a species as powerful as yours want to help? Help. Marcus looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of beings he had come to know as classmates and friends, even though they had never known what he really was. Because, he said simply, that's what intelligent species do. They find others like themselves, and they build something better together than any of them could build alone. It's not about power or conquest, it's about community. He paused, then added with a slight smile. Besides, stubborn Deathworld predators are excellent at protecting communities from external threats. We might actually be the best neighbors you've ever had. The silence that followed wasn't filled with fear this time, but with the sound of an entire galaxy's worldview quietly rearranging itself. Director Talvin was the first to speak. I believe, she said slowly, we have a great deal to discuss. Marcus nodded. We have time. After all, patience is another one of those Deathworld traits that Professor Vexhai mentioned. As formal contact protocols began and the initial shock wore off, Marcus realized that his mission had succeeded in ways he had never anticipated. He had come to learn how the galaxy viewed humanity. But in the process, he had discovered something more important: how humanity might view the galaxy, not as prey to be hunted, not as territory to be conquered, but as a community to be protected and a civilization worthy of joining. It would take time for both sides to adjust to this new reality. The galaxy would need to overcome their fear of humanity's capabilities, and humans would need to learn to work within established systems rather than simply rebuilding everything from scratch. But as he looked around the assembly hall at the mixture of fear, curiosity, and tentative hope in the faces around him, Marcus felt confident that both species would adapt. After all, adaptation was what survivors did best.